This is our armchair history for the month, and I am Liz Fuller from the Historical Society, and we also want to thank the Friends of the Library for their support in getting the word out about these programs. So, let's get started. So with the anniversary of the 19th Amendment this past week, Susan B. Anthony has been in the news. So I'm sure most of you have probably heard that she was given a presidential pardon last week. So obviously, Ms. Anthony was not here to receive it, and she doesn't have any descendants to stand in for her to give their opinion of whether she would have accepted or rejected the pardon. So I thought it would be interesting to understand a little bit more about why she was arrested and convicted, and then to let you all decide what you think her reaction would have been, whether you think she would have accepted the pardon or turned it down. So here's the timeline of the fight for women's voting rights in the United States. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in upstate New York in 1848. Susan B. Anthony became involved with the movement a few years later when she was 32 years old. And then she continued to focus her energies on women's right to vote for the rest of her life. And even though she lived to be 86 years old, she did not live long enough to achieve this goal. So in addition to working for women's right to vote, the early women's movement were also very focused on the abolition of slavery. The women worked very hard to abolish slavery, and it was actually this cause that really helped them find their political voice and to realize that they could make a difference. Then after the Civil War, they assumed that they would be able to secure the right to vote for the freed slaves and for themselves. So it was incredibly galling to them that when the 15th Amendment was passed, it excluded women. The amendment stated that voting rights could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but it said nothing about denying the right based on gender. So the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. At the next election, next presidential election in 1872, Susan B. Anthony got a group of women together, including some of her sisters, and they went down to the local courthouse to register to vote. And when they got there, they were initially told to go away. But Susan B. had come prepared. She began to lecture the registrars on the 14th Amendment, which had been ratified 7 years earlier in 1865. Anthony pointed out that the amendment said no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So she told them that the government had absolutely no trouble identifying her as a citizen when it came time to pay taxes. So if she was a citizen for that, then she was a citizen for voting and she was entitled to vote. So she lectured them for about an hour, and finally they agreed to let her register. Now, actually that came as a surprise to her. That wasn't actually what her initial expectation was of that day. She really expected to be denied to register to vote. And then her plan was to get denied and then to sue for her right in the federal court. But she was just too good at arguing and wore them down, and she was actually permitted to register. So she made a different plan. So 4 days later, it was election day, and so she and the other ladies who she'd managed to get registered went down to the polling area, and they said that they wanted to vote. So again, she was met with resistance, and again, she argued. So they went round and round, and the poll workers were really in a tough spot because if they were not allowed to let somebody vote who was not allowed to vote, but they also weren't allowed to stop somebody who was allowed to vote. And so they really weren't sure what to do. So finally they said to her, they asked her to take an oath that she believed she was eligible to vote. And so she did take the oath, and so then they let her vote, and she cast her ballot for Ulysses Grant. So not too long after that, the sheriff sent someone to her house, and he told her that she needed to come into town because the sheriff would like to see her, and he wanted her to turn herself in. And so she said, is this the way that you arrest men? And they said, well, no. And so she said, well, I want you to do it the same way you do for men. And so she held out her hands and said, just handcuff me and haul me off. So they declined to handcuff her, but they did escort her to jail. And once she got there, she was charged with voting illegally, and she was put in jail to await trial. Now, her plan at that point was that she could appeal to the higher court, to say that she was being unlawfully imprisoned. So that was her plan, to be in jail. But her lawyer just couldn't stand it. He said he just couldn't stand to see someone he respected so much in jail, and so he bailed her out. And so then she was a bit upset with him because he ruined her ability to appeal. But he said, I couldn't stand to see you in there. So she made another plan. And so what she did was she made the most of her time between her arrest and her upcoming trial. And she went around to every county or every town in that county and gave speeches about how her rights were being violated. And she caused so much uproar that the courts actually moved her trial to an adjacent county, and because they didn't think it could be fair in her county. And so then she quickly went around and delivered speeches at every town there too. So by the time her trial came, it was a pretty big deal in the press, and there were many people waiting to hear the outcome. And she was in the press so much that they even stopped using her full name, and they just started referring to her as Susan B., which I kind of like. It sounds like a rapper name. And everyone knew who she was. So this picture is a close-up of a political cartoon from that time, and that's Susan B. in the middle. And then on the sides, in the background, you'll notice on the left, there's a woman wearing a police uniform. And on the right, there's a man holding a baby. And this was intended to show the topsy-turvy world that would ensue if Susan B. won her court case. Women would be policing things, and men would be relegated to taking care of children. So her trial got so much press that there was even a former president in attendance. Millard Fillmore, the 13th president, came over from Buffalo, where he practiced law, to watch the proceedings, because the decision in her case was considered to be the test for whether any American woman would be allowed to vote. So her attorney, this was the man who bailed her out of jail because he couldn't stand to see her suffer, he argued that she did not violate the law because the Enforcement Act said that a person cannot knowingly vote illegally, and because she believed she had the right to vote, it was legal. And he also used the trial to espouse some beliefs about the women's suffrage movement, so he tried to work in some politics in there too. He was for women's suffrage. The judge in her trial was a man named Ward Hunt, and Ward Hunt had recently been appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but somehow he was also over the federal courts of this jurisdiction, and he presided over her case. And even though he had been appointed as this judge, he never had actually served as a trial judge previously. And his handling of this trial was very controversial, and it was argued about for years afterwards. So Anthony's defense was that she couldn't have voted illegally because she honestly believed that the 14th Amendment gave her the right to vote, and the judge was not having it. And in fact, he wrote his decision before the trial even started, just based on what he knew about it. And so he had it ready, and he ruled that the state of New York had every right to deny her the right to vote. And he also ruled that this issue was really some kind of technical point of law that should be decided by a judge, and it was not really a criminal act that could be decided by a jury. And therefore, he just told the jury, he directed them to return a guilty verdict. He didn't let them discuss it, and he didn't poll the jury to see how they would have voted otherwise. And then during the trial, he also denied Susan B. the opportunity to speak in her own defense. So she was forced to sit there silently while her attorney and the judge determined her fate. So he did all of that, but then he made his biggest mistake. So as is pretty much routine in most trials, the judge asked her whether she had anything to say before he pronounced her sentence. So with most defendants, that's sort of a rhetorical question. It's a routine question, you don't get much response. But not with Ms. Anthony. She stood up and gave a full speech about all the ways her rights had been violated and the need for women to secure their voting rights by any means necessary. And she went on for so long that the judge interrupted her and asked her to stop talking 5 different times. She would not be silenced. She just kept on and finished what she had to say in what has been called the most famous speech in the history of the agitation for women's suffrage. So finally, when she was finished, the judge ordered her to pay a $100 fine. And she announced that she would never pay that fine. Now, she was hoping that the judge would throw her in jail because then she could appeal her sentence to a higher court. But the judge kind of knew what she was up to, and so he ordered that she would not be put in jail. And however, she lived nearly 40 more years, and in all that time, she kept her word and she never did pay the fine. So even though she never sought a presidential pardon for herself, but what she did do is she sent a request to Congress asking them to cancel her fine because she felt her conviction was unjust. And one congressman did actually bring a bill to the floor asking that her fine be removed because it was unjust, but he couldn't get it passed. So the trial gave Susan B. and the women's cause a lot of press. Some considered her a martyr to the cause, while others considered her a common criminal. One New York paper observed, if it's a mere question of who got the best of it, Miss Anthony is still ahead. She has voted, and the American Constitution has survived the shock. Fining her $100 does not rule out the fact that women voted and went home, and the world jogged on as before. So that brings us to last week's presidential pardon. So we of course have no way of knowing whether Susan B. would have accepted the pardon or turned it down. We do know that she never sought a pardon in her lifetime, but that she did help get pardons for the 2 election workers who had allowed her to vote. Those men had also been charged and tried and convicted. They had served jail times and they'd lost their positions. So she had some friends in Congress. She spoke to them, she got word, and through them she got word to President Grant about their plight, and he did pardon them. So it's kind of reasonable to assume that had she wanted a pardon, she would have at least requested one for herself. And here's why it's even a question, because it seems like, well, why wouldn't you want a pardon? But accepting a pardon implies that you are accepting guilt. You're admitting that you did something wrong and that you would like to be forgiven for it. But Ms. Anthony's entire defense was that she had not done anything wrong. She believed that she had a right to vote, and if anything, it was the government that was in the wrong, not her. So you can come to your own conclusion about what you would think, but personally, I think perhaps the better gesture would have been to respond to her own handwritten plea to Congress and to have canceled her outstanding $100 fine as unjust. So back to our timeline. I want to point out that even though Susan B. Anthony didn't have the opportunity to appeal her case all the way to the Supreme Court, that doesn't mean the National Women's Suffrage Association gave up trying to get a judicial solution. So the year after her trial, a woman named Virginia Minor tried to register to vote in Missouri, and she was denied. So when she was denied, she sued the registrar for prohibiting her constitutional right. And her case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in a case called Minor versus Happersett. And the women suffragists waited anxiously for the outcome. But there was a unanimous decision from the justices, including Judge Ward Hunt, the man who presided over Susan B. Anthony's trial, and they determined that the Constitution did not grant anyone, in this case specifically a female citizen of the state of Missouri, a right to vote, even when a state law granted rights to vote to a certain class of citizens. So in other words, having the right to vote is not included in your rights as a citizen, was what they decided at the time. So, like the passage of the 15th Amendment, this Supreme Court ruling was a big blow to the women's suffrage organization. But they didn't give up. They decided if they couldn't get a judicial solution, they would try for a legislative one. And so they submitted a bill to Congress to amend the Constitution, and this bill became known as the Susan B. Anthony Bill. It was submitted in 1878, and it would be more than 40 more years before it was passed in 1919. So this is the actual wording of the Anthony Amendment that languished in Congress for more than 40 years. It says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So as I said, it's hard today to imagine just how controversial this was and how strong the opposition to it was, but we'll see that. And, but before we do, I want to address a couple of common misconceptions about women's suffrage. So the first is that many people in the United States think that we were the first country that gave women the right to vote, but that's not the case. There were 15 countries that gave women the right to vote before the United States did. And another misconception is that no women in the United States had the right to vote prior to the 19th Amendment. But again, that's not true. There were already states where women had full voting rights in all elections, and then there were others in which they had partial rights. So the dark green states on this map were the ones that gave full suffrage to women, with Wyoming being the very first to do so. And then the light green ones have partial rights, and then the light yellow ones are the ones where women had absolutely no right to vote. And you can see where North Carolina falls into that pattern. So let's talk about what it was like to be a woman in Southport during those years before women got the right to vote. Now, this is an early picture of Jessie Stevens Taylor, back when her name was still Jessie Stevens. And Jessie Taylor went on to have a major influence on life in Southport throughout her long life. But I like this picture of when she was young, first of all, because she looks so young and happy and pretty in it. But there's more to this picture than you might think at first. So you'll notice that both of these young women are standing with their bicycles. And in the 1890s, when this picture was taken, bicycles were often seen as an instrument of feminism. You see, bicycles gave women increased mobility and independence. Women riding bikes was quite controversial. In fact, many people, including doctors, thought that bicycling was not suitable for women because it was so tiring. And not only that, it would lead to a serious condition called bicycle face. It was believed that women would be working so hard to pedal and concentrating so hard on maintaining their balance that they would turn all red and sweaty, and they would scrunch up their faces, and that would eventually stay that way and leave them unattractive and undesirable. Now, Susan B. Anthony had a different view of bicycles. She said, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood." And I think that that's what I like best about this picture, because it shows Jessie Stevens in a moment of free and untrammeled womanhood. So Jessie was not actually born in Southport. She moved here with her family from Chicago when she was 9 years old. She attended Smithville Academy, and the principal of that school was Kate Stewart, a leading businesswoman in Southport that you might have heard of in some of our other programs. And Jessie's father was E.B. Stevens. He was a business leader in Southport, and her husband was C.E. Taylor, it's her father on the left and her husband on the right, whom she married in 1909, and he was a rising attorney. Both the men were proponents of bringing the railroad to town. And Jessie also had ambitions for Southport. She wanted the town to be ready for the increased business and visitors that the railroad would bring. And she knew that there were some issues in town of maybe cleanliness and safety and beautification that needed to be addressed. So Jessie decided to start a women's club. There was a social movement in the United States at that time that was known as the Women's Club movement. It established the idea that women had a moral duty and responsibility to transform public policy. And this movement was especially embraced by white middle-class Protestant women. Most of these clubs started out as social and literary gatherings, but they eventually became a source of reform for various issues surrounding education, temperance, environmental protection, library creation, and more. And the clubs allowed women who had little political standing at the time to gain greater influence in their communities. It also gave the women opportunities for leadership, for organization, for networking, and public speaking, which were roles that they might never have had the opportunity to do otherwise. So Jessie engaged many of the leading ladies of the town, including the mayor's wife, to join the club, which they named the Southport Civic Club. In particular, she tapped her former principal, Kate Stewart, to be the club's first president. Kate was the proprietor of the Stewart Inn, and she was a significant landowner in Southport. She was also the only woman on the Chamber of Commerce. She had close connections to the lawyers and judges of the county court because many of them stayed at her inn whenever they were in town. She was also working hard to bring the railroad to town. So she, like the other business leaders in town, all hoped that Southport would fulfill its destiny and become the port of the South. So the members of the Civic Club got busy, and they persuaded local businesses to use trash barrels instead of throwing their trash in the street. They then got them to move those barrels behind their businesses instead of having them sitting out in front. They painted street signs, they put benches in front of the garrison lawn, they promoted planting flowers and gardens and cleaning the cemetery, they had beautification contests, they also promoted better child health through education and better baby parades. They opened the first library in Southport in the east wing of the garrison at Fort Johnston, and they provided the first collection of books. They gathered up 400 books of their own and made that the collection for the town, and they paid the salary of the librarian. And they also focused on public health by trying to reduce the number of sand spurs and the breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And all of this was accomplished in the first 10 years of the club's existence. Despite women having no opportunity to vote in North Carolina, from the very beginning, the club focused on politics. And one of the first activities the club arranged was a steamboat trip to Wilmington to hear President Taft speak. The ladies all met at the pier at 6 a.m. and they took the morning passage to Wilmington to hear the president for their very selves. Now, since it was in the era without television or even the radio, hearing a president speak was a rare opportunity, especially in North Carolina. The women continued their political activities once they got back, and they invited the mayor and aldermen to several of their meetings to discuss their concerns and their plans for the future of the town. So, while the women of Southport were working so hard to improve their town, the women in Washington, D.C. were working to improve their country. Two of these women were Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. So when the Susan B. Anthony bill failed to get any traction in Congress, it just languished there, Carrie Catt decided to focus her energy on the individual states. So she and the National Women's Suffrage Association started working with state legislatures to get women the vote. And that's why on that map that I showed you earlier, there were states that could already vote by the time the 19th Amendment happened, and that's because of the work of Carrie Catt. But the progress was very slow. By 1912, they still only had 9 states where women could vote. Now, part of the way that she went about this was she implemented something called the Society Plan. And this was a campaign to recruit wealthy members of this rapidly growing women's club movement, because they had time and money and experience and they could help with the suffrage movement. So I've gone through the records of Southport's women's club records, and I can't find any reference to to women's rights or to having been contacted. But since Southport was just a small town in North Carolina, they wouldn't really have been the target demographic for that movement. So another woman involved in this effort was named Alice Paul. Now, for me, when I look at this, I see some similarities between Alice Paul and Jessie Stevens Taylor. They were approximately the same age. They both had a great deal of self-confidence and vision, and they both knew how to get things done. So Alice Paul had actually spent some time working with the suffragettes in the United Kingdom. And the British women took a much more radical approach to suffrage than the women in the United States. But when Alice came back with this experience, she returned to the States and she looked at what Carrie Catt was doing, and she just grew impatient with Mrs. Catt's state-by-state approach. She didn't agree with it, and she felt that they really should refocus on getting a constitutional amendment and getting it changed all at once. But Paul was a Quaker, and she didn't believe in violence like she had seen in the UK. So she preferred to use civil disobedience. But even that was seen as radical when it was being performed by middle-class women. So her first idea was to hold a parade, and not just any parade, but a parade composed entirely of women marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. on the day before the inauguration of the newly elected president, Woodrow Wilson. So she and her organization recruited 5,000 women, and they created 24 floats, and they marched down the main thoroughfares of Washington. And she persuaded the labor lawyer Inez Milholland to dress as a woman warrior astride a white horse to lead the procession. And then she grouped the women by location and by career. So she had all the representatives of each state walking together. She had the teachers walking together. She had the college graduates walking together. They wore their caps and gowns to show that they had graduated. And then they broke up these groups of women with floats. And in this picture, what you see are women marching, holding placards with the signatures of 1 million women on them. So even though it was 5,000 women in the parade, which was a huge number, they were actually representing 1 million women who couldn't join them. She instructed all the women to dress well and to dress femininely so that they could contradict the stereotypes that feminists were unfeminine and unattractive. And she told them to march with dignity and poise as though they would be responsible voters. So nowadays, this parade doesn't seem too radical to us, but it really was at the time. There had never been a parade of women this large. And at the time, there was still a perception that the only women who walked in the streets by themselves were streetwalkers. So it was a spectacle to see so many women self-confidently striding down the street without the accompaniment of any men. So one challenge that Alice Paul faced in organizing her parade was what to do with the African American women who showed up for the parade and wanted to participate and demonstrate for their rights as citizens. And this question of what to do about Black women wasn't just a problem with the parade, it was a problem with the entire women's rights movement. It was threatening enough to the establishment to think of white women voting, but the idea of African American women voting was really threatening. And therefore, the National Women's Suffrage organizations tried to downplay the involvement of Black women. So Paul worried that if she allowed the women to appear too publicly, she risked losing the support of the Southern constituents. So she told the African American women, some of whom had traveled across the country at their own expense to be there, that they needed to walk at the back of the parade. Now, one woman who refused to march in the back was Ida Wells from Chicago. Ida was an investigative journalist, an educator, and a civil rights advocate who was best known for her work to fight lynching in America. She told Paul that she would march with them or not at all. So as the parade started, she stood on the sidelines. And when the Illinois delegates marched past, she stepped out of the crowd and joined the white women from her state. and she marched with them, walking between two white supporters. So at first, everything went smoothly for the marching women, but gradually the crowds of onlookers, which were estimated to be about 500,000 people, disrupted the parade with jeers and mockery. Men refused to clear the way for the parading women, and then the police failed to intervene, and that's when things got violent. One observer remembered women were spit upon, slapped in the face, tripped up, pelted with burning cigar stubs, and insulted by jeers and obscene language that was too vile to print or repeat. Over 200 people were injured, and another 169 were arrested for obstructing traffic once they reached the White House. Another observer noted, through all the confusion and turmoil, the women marched calmly, keeping a military formation as best they could. But again, the police did little to contain the violence because they believed that the women had brought this on themselves. So, despite all the violence, from Alice Paul's point of view, the parade was a smashing success, and it was a turning point in the movement. By overshadowing Wilson's inauguration, the suffragists had made it clear that they would not be ignored. But even though the parade got publicity for the cause, it still didn't accomplish the goal of getting the amendment passed. So Alice Paul's next idea was to picket the White House. Now again, this sounds rather tame now, but at the time it had never been done before. The Washington Herald called the effort the most militant move ever made by the suffragists of this country. And once again, Alice Paul paid great attention to detail. She told the women how to dress and how to behave. The protesters did not sing or chant or engage with the public. They were called silent sentinels. They simply stood at the entrances to the White House and made sure that the president was forced to see them whether he was coming or going. They had large banners, and they let the banners speak for themselves. They appeared every single day, rain or shine. Women came from all over the country to participate in these protests. Alice arranged specific days for nurses or teachers or wage earners. And she had days for women from specific states or cities. And in all, over 2,000 women took part in the pickets. Many of them traveled a long distance just to be able to participate. Each woman worked a 4-hour shift, which could seem very long, especially in bad weather. They started the pickets in January, and after a few months, it appeared like it might be working. People were becoming more and more aware of their cause, and they even seemed to be becoming a little sympathetic. But then spring came, and in April of 1917, President Wilson went before Congress and requested that they declare war on Germany because we needed to make the world safe for democracy. He said, "We shall fight for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government." So when war was declared, the main body of the suffrage association that was led by Mrs. Catt decided that they needed to back off. They needed to focus their efforts on supporting the war. And they felt that now was not the time to pursue changes in the government or to criticize the president. But Alice Paul saw no reason to back off. In fact, she increased the pressure on Wilson. She ramped up her banners and she started using his own words against him. She wanted everyone to see the hypocrisy of a nation fighting a foreign war for democracy when its own citizens didn't have the right to vote. Now the public, which had started to be sympathetic to the cause, turned against the women. They didn't think the women should be criticizing the president in the time of war. Passers-by started to heckle them and to throw things at them, and eventually the police began to arrest them for protesting and charging them with obstruction of traffic. So at first, the punishments were small. It was a fine or a few days in jail. The women refused to pay the fine, saying that doing so would admit that they were guilty when they hadn't committed any crime. So eventually the punishments got more and more severe, and then until Alice Paul was sentenced to prison for 7 months. And then one night in November of 1917, 33 women were arrested, and the prison superintendent told his guards to teach the women a lesson. They were beaten and tortured in an incident that became known as the Night of Terror. Alice Paul, who was serving her prison term, and some of the other women began a hunger strike in protest of the unfair treatment of the women suffragists, and they wanted to raise awareness that they were being held as political prisoners. Now, the authorities didn't want the women to die because then they would become martyrs for their cause, so they began force-feeding them, which is a brutal and torturous treatment. So soon, word got out about how the United States was treating these women simply for peacefully protesting their inability to vote, and they were released. And on January 9th, 1918, almost a year to the day after the Silent Sentinels began their militant protest, President Wilson announced his support for a federal amendment for women's suffrage. And 2 months later, the arrests, trials, and punishments of the picketers were ruled unconstitutional by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So up until then, Wilson had always contended that the question of women's suffrage was a state issue. But he had a change of heart, and it was due to several reasons. So in part, it was the pressure and embarrassment of Alice Paul's public stunts. It was also the behind-the-scenes lobbying by Carrie Catt of the larger women's suffrage organization. And it was the growing sentiment of the nearly 2 million women who already did have the right to vote and who were becoming a stronger political power. But finally, and very importantly, it was the contribution of the nearly 9 million women who supported the war effort by joining the Red Cross, backfilling for the men who were serving overseas, or serving themselves as nurses, ambulance drivers, and telephone operators. So in September of 1918, he addressed Congress, and in part his words were, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not a partnership of privilege?" The president's words had an effect, and the House passed a bill to send the suffrage amendment to the states. However, the Senate was 2 votes short. The women had tried multiple times to get it through the Senate, and it was just dead in the water. So they considered their options, and they decided on a 2-prong approach. First, they would continue to try to get states to vote for women's ability to vote. They were trying to get it passed in 4 more states. They already had 12 states that had approved it, and if they could get 4 more, that would apply even more pressure on Congress to approve the amendment. So they decided to pursue Oklahoma, Louisiana, Michigan, and South Dakota. So at the same time they were doing that, they decided they would also try to get 4 senators removed from their seats in the upcoming midterm election. There were 4 senators who were strongly opposed to the bill, and they were running against opponents who said that they would vote in favor of it. So the women were going to work at those 2 initiatives at the same time, and they had it all planned out. But then a crisis struck. In September of 1918, just 2 months before the election, the Spanish flu pandemic was raging in the United States. It eventually killed 675,000 people in the United States and 50 million worldwide. So Boston and Philadelphia were hit very hard, followed by Washington, D.C., where the women's movement was headquartered. In Congress, Champ Clark, who was the powerful Speaker of the House, caught the Spanish flu. And in the Senate, where the suffrage bill had languished, the galleries from which the suffragists kept an eye on proceedings were closed. There was no other way for them to know what was going on. There was no C-SPAN, there was no anything. They sat in the galleries and watched what was going on, and they closed those because of the pandemic. Then, the U.S. Public Health Service issued a nationwide advisory to local health departments to prohibit large meetings and gatherings. So the suffragist election campaigns were immediately compromised. They had to postpone a train tour that they had planned of those previously arrested suffrage protesters. So those women who had been imprisoned and beaten and gone through all those things, they were going to have them go on a train tour, a whistle stop tour, and talk to people at each of the stations. And they had expected that to draw great crowds along its route from Washington, D.C. all the way to Oregon. And they had to cancel that because of the pandemic. Then on the second floor of the suffrage house in the nation's capital, Carrie Chapman Catt was chained to her bed by the flu. She was so sick she could not get out of bed. But nonetheless, she was determined to consult on strategy with a close ally of the president, Montana Senator Thomas John Walsh. But he too was stricken with the flu. So she couldn't come downstairs out of her bed and he couldn't go up. So they had an intermediary shuttle between the both of them to conduct their confidential discussion, which must have been a really interesting game of telephone tag. So they had bans on public gatherings. They had all these plans made for these big groups, but they had to switch gears. And so they switched to the personal touch. And so the women started reaching out directly to neighbors and friends. They emphasized their patriotism. They quoted the president saying that votes for women was a proper reward for their wartime sacrifice. The national headquarters provided more than 1 million pamphlets for distribution door to door and 300 weekly bulletins for placement in local newspapers. Women signed petitions urging male voters to pass the 4 states referendums. More than anything, it was the extensive grassroots organizations the suffragettes had perfected that carried them through. They'd been laying the basis for their campaigns long before the influenza barreled in. Cities and towns in each state had their own organizations linked to the national strategy, and local women had developed sophisticated political skills. They knew how to identify opportunities and overcome obstacles. South Dakota and Michigan had already held several referendums by the time the flu arrived, and all that preparation was really crucial. So by this time, the pandemic was moving west from the ravaged cities on the Atlantic seaboard, and the referendum of South Dakota sustained a heavy blow. They said, just when we had plans developed for a renewed and revised campaign, along comes the influenza and cuts off all possibility of public speaking and even meetings in open air. Apparently they hadn't heard of Zoom. So many homes have been touched in each locality, if not with the actual disease, with the dreadful fear, which seems to be worse, that we have not been able to work with the individual voter. So they couldn't even go door to door in South Dakota because people were afraid to interact. Raising money was impossible, and many suffrage workers were distracted because they were volunteering for the Red Cross or in hospitals, helping with the pandemic. The pandemic suppressed voter turnout. This was in November. The flu really heated up in the end of September. It was still going on when the election day came around. So it suppressed voter turnout with 3 million fewer ballots cast than the 1914 midterm election. But even so, the referendums in Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma did pass, and with a good margin. People were just grateful for the role women played during the war and in the pandemic, and they think that that influenced the results. In addition, because so many physicians were away in the war effort, nurses really had to step up during the pandemic and care for the sick. And so again, that brought the women's contribution to light. The only referendum that's failed of the 4 that they were going after was Louisiana. They weren't too surprised about that. It was the first initiative in the South, and I don't think they really expected to win that one. So, despite all those obstacles, in June 1919, just a few months later, the 19th Amendment was passed by both houses, and it was sent to the states to be ratified. And from there, the amendment moved pretty swiftly through the process of getting 2/3 of the states to vote. In part because there were 20, by that time, there were 20 states that at least had partial voting rights for women. But there was still considerable opposition, and especially in North Carolina and other southern states. So what was the opposition? What was the reason that they were so concerned? So there were men involved in the anti-suffrage movement in the United States. But interestingly, most anti-suffrage groups were actually led and supported by women. These women viewed voting as a burden that women shouldn't be forced to take on. They felt women were too delicate to endure the physical and intellectual strain of politics. They worried that it would ruin the family and turn the relationships between the sexes all around. It would make women unfeminine. And they also suspected that suffragists were probably socialists. So here are some postcards from that time that shows some of the fears that they were feeling. So the card on the left says, the origin and development of a suffragette. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. And then we see this gathering of these old maids, and you can see the signs on the wall, down with man, husbands for old maids. And it says, at the suffragette meetings, you can hear some plain things and see them too. So, you know, the joke was these were women who were too unattractive and too old to get a man, and so they just wanted to cause trouble. And then this one says, when women get the right to vote, apparently then men will have absolutely no say about who they marry. And so we see here, weddings while you wait, registry office open all day and night. Marriage is by the hour, day, or job. I really don't know what this postcard is about, but it's obvious that letting women vote is just going to change everything. And then here's this last one. It says, when women vote, and you see the man in the back just taking care of the baby and doing the laundry and laboring away, and we see that he's got his working hours are from 3 a.m. to midnight, doing washing and darning and cleaning and scrubbing and marketing and more work on the weekends, while the women sit around and smoke cigarettes and play cards and eat chocolate and say bad things about their husbands. So this is obviously what letting women vote is going to lead to. And then we see these three postcards. The one on the left, it's election day, and I don't know if you can see the little sampler. The man is in the rocking chair with the babies, and it says, it says something about behind, you can't have a suffragette without a suffering family. I can't quite read it, but that's what it says. And then the middle one, what will men wear when women wear pants? And then the last one, she's putting on pants. Nobody loves me, guess I'll be a suffragette. So these show some of the fears, some of the outlandish things people were spreading around that was going to happen. But those reasons are all really superficial. They played on people's fears and biases, and they distracted them from the real underlying issues. They were not the deep-seated reasons against the bill. If you think about it, as long as our country has had democracy, people have tried to control who could vote. And for the most part, people have tried to stop other people from voting if they thought they were going to vote the wrong way. So some of the strongest opponents of women voting were those who were afraid of how she would vote. In general, the liquor industry had been a strong opponent of women voting rights because they thought it would lead to prohibition. Of course, by the time that the 19th Amendment passed, prohibition was already the law of the land. In North Carolina, the factories, especially the textile mills in the Piedmont area, were opposed to women voting because they thought it would lead to reductions in child labor and work hours and an increase in safety precautions. And then there was the question of states' rights. Throughout the South, including North Carolina, there was a large concern that giving women the vote would open the door for Black women to vote. Voting among African-American men had been suppressed since 1900 through the implementation of literacy tests and the grandfather clause. And so many were concerned that giving women the vote would open up all that back up again. So many white supremacists argued that suffrage was a state right to decide, not the federal government's, because they argued if it was a state law and it didn't work out, then the state could change their mind and put it back and eliminate it. Now, ironically, there were also white supremacists who felt that women's suffrage would be a good thing for the cause. They had done the math, and they had calculated that since white women outnumbered black women in North Carolina, even if black women got the right to vote, the whites would still have a majority. So they felt that adding more whites to the voting rolls could only help the cause. Now, down in Southport, the men and women of Brunswick County were trying to educate themselves about the Anthony Amendment, as it was called. A woman from the Baltimore Division of Women's Suffrage named Lola Trax, along with representatives of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association and local sympathizers, spoke at the courthouse in favor of the amendment. And attendance was so high by both men and women that it was standing room only. So the reason that I have these two flowers up here is that they were symbols for which side people came down on the topic of women's suffrage. So people didn't wear t-shirts back then with slogans on them to make it easy, or ball caps and things so you knew who was who. So instead they used flowers. So those who were anti-suffrage wore a red rose, and those who were for it wore a yellow one. And as each state legislature met to decide the votes, men and women wore flowers on their lapels, the actual senators and congressmen, and then the people in the gallery wore the flowers to indicate which way they were going to vote. Now, the amendment gets passed by the federal legislature, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So in 1919, that meant that 36 states had to approve it. And in August of 1919, when the Anthony Amendment came up for vote in North Carolina, 1920, 35 states had already approved it. The next state to approve it would make it an official amendment to the Constitution. So the question came down to the North Carolina legislature. Would they vote for it, or would they vote against it? What to do. Because there was a strong, especially around Raleigh and Wilmington, there was a strong push for the amendment, and then and the governor had decided that we might as well just bow to the inevitable and be on the right side of history and go ahead and approve it, even though he personally didn't like it. So there was definitely something on both sides. So in the end, North Carolina decided to do neither. They didn't vote for it or against it. Instead, because they didn't vote at all, instead they decided to table the decision until the following year. Now, they knew very well that there wouldn't be a decision the following year, that sometime in the next year another state was going to approve it, but it wouldn't be them. And so they tabled it and didn't, without casting a vote. So that meant that the amendment went to Tennessee next. So the North Carolina legislature very quickly sent a telegram to the Tennessee legislature and urged them to table their decision as well. So when the Tennessee legislature met the following week, that was the plan. They were going to vote to table the amendment. Now, this man here on the left, that's Harry T Byrne. And he was the youngest member of the legislature in Tennessee. He was only 24 in 1920. Most of the men in the legislature were in their 60s. And some of these older men had taken Harry under their wing, and they had advised him on how he should behave and even on how he should vote. So Harry knew what the plan was, and he was in agreement with postponing the vote on the amendment. It made sense to him. And just like his older friends in the government, he wore a red flower on his lapel and went along with his friends and his elders, and he agreed to follow their more experienced lead in this matter. But as so often happens, things didn't go according to plan. When the vote came to table the amendment, Harry voted with his friends like he was supposed to, but the count was a tie, 48 to 48. The motion didn't pass. So instead of tabling the vote, the assembly decided they would vote that day on the amendment. If any one man in the room changed his vote, the tie would be broken. If two men did, the required majority would be met and the motion would either pass or fail, depending on which way it went. So as Harry Byrne sat there waiting to cast his vote, the enormity of his decision settled upon him. In his pocket was a letter from his mother. She had written to him that day, and she advised him to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat with her rats, meaning ratification, meaning vote for women's suffrage. So when it came Harry's turn to vote, he surprised everyone in the chamber and maybe even himself by casting an aye vote. And in the uproar that followed, one other legislator changed his vote, and to the consternation of many in the room, the 19th Amendment of the Constitution became law. Later, Harry said that as he sat there waiting his turn to vote, he thought about how his mother was the smartest person he knew, and yet she was not allowed to vote. He said, "I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." He said, "I appreciated the fact that an opportunity such as seldom comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine." So in Washington, D.C., Alice Paul and the women of the National Women's Party celebrated their victory. Of course, since Prohibition was the law of the land, they had to toast with grape juice. And back in Southport, it appears that there was a great deal of support for the amendment as well, at least among the women of the Civic Club and the local government. Now, Anna Miller Davis, see her on the left, was a young married woman, and she became the first woman to register to vote in Brunswick County. Anna had moved to Southport in her teens, along with her parents and her brother. Her brother, unfortunately, had been killed in an accident at a military base the year before. And her parents were German immigrants who owned the popular Miller Hotel and Cafe at the corner of Howe and Bay Street. And that's in that picture there, you can see the hotel. Her father was also involved in politics. He was actually a registered socialist, and he had run for governor of North Carolina the previous year. However, he only got 3 votes in Brunswick County. Perhaps if his wife and daughter had been able to vote, he could have gotten 5. So Anna registered, but there's no indication that she registered as a socialist. And after she registered to vote, she was asked to participate in some educational programs encouraging other women to vote. So the mayor, J.W. Ruark, also presented in these programs, which were sponsored by the Southport Civic Club, which by then had changed its name to the Women's Club, which is what it's still known as today. So the Women's Club held other educational programs with presentations by the former mayor, R.W. Davis, and a series of classes on citizenship rights and duties. And the members of the Women's Club also went door to door in Southport, encouraging women to register to vote. The 19th Amendment was a big victory for women in Southport and across the country. But there's one final misconception that I want to talk about the 19th Amendment, and that was that from that point on, all women were able to vote. But unfortunately, that was not the case, even in Southport. So if any of you attended the class I gave last spring on the 1918 flu pandemic, you might remember that we talked about a young Southport woman named Anna Clements. Anna was a trained nurse with several years of experience. She'd been unable to help in the war effort, the World War I war effort, because she was African American and the military was not accepting any Black women as nurses. But she had been available to help with the 1918 flu epidemic at great personal risk, and she even received a certificate for her heroism. But even after all that sacrifice, when she went to register to vote, she was turned away. So this was 1920. It was a period of intense racial violence in this country. In fact, 1919 had been the deadliest year in the country's history in terms of racial violence. Over 1,000 African Americans across the United States, both in the South and the North, were killed by white mobs through lynching, arson, and other acts of mob violence. Across the entire country, participation in the Ku Klux Klan was the highest it had ever been. So all of that is to say that it took a lot of courage for Anna to attempt to vote. And then, when she did, she was turned away. But at that point, she did something even more courageous. She decided to write a letter. And who'd she write that letter to? The National Women's Party in Washington, D.C., the organization that was run by none other than Alice Paul. So I don't have a picture of Anna, but I put up a picture of Alice Paul just to help you remember what organization she is writing to. I'm still on the lookout for a picture of Anna, so if anybody knows of anybody who has one, I would really like to see it. But here is Anna's letter. She wrote to the National Women's Party in Washington, D.C. and said, I am an American colored woman, property owner in Brunswick County, state of North Carolina, and am seeking a way to vote by mail if there is a way, because a colored person in my country is unable to vote because they are colored. Please send me information how to send votes or register to General Headquarters by mail before it is too late to register. I'm obliged, Anna Clements. Isn't that something? For a young woman from a small North Carolina town to even think of writing to a national organization at that time, it just astounds me. So Anna heard back from the National Women's Party. Let me move this closer. The secretary, Emma Wold, wrote her back. It appears that Ms. Wold didn't entirely understand Anna's situation. She said, my dear Ms. Clements, your letter of October 10th inquiring about registration and voting by mail in North Carolina has just come in my hands. Registration must be made in person in North Carolina and in the precinct in which you live. It is possible to vote by mail on applying for a ballot to the county board. Registrations close on October 23rd. As you undoubtedly understand, no one may register to or vote outside of his own precinct. We have been making inquiries and learned that colored women are being registered in North Carolina. Have you tried personally? If not, will you try and let us know the result? Should the registration board refuse to register you, we shall be glad to look into the matter and see what can be done about it. Please be sure to let us know the result of your attempt to register. So Anna wrote him back. And she said, my dear Miss Wold, in reply to your letter, which was duly received yesterday, will take the greatest of pleasure to write you my result in attempting or trying to register. I went before the registrator on October 15th and was refused to be registered, as this board requires all colored to be able to read and write to suit the registrator, and all persons of colored origin in this whole county have been unable to suit the registrator. North Carolina laws require one to be able to read and write to register. Still, we have in our county ones to fill requirements, then they are refused. I hope and ask if you should have this matter investigated, that please do not let my name be brought into this matter, because there is so much prejudice existing until I am most assured I will be a victim of lawless mob. To show you I am no agitator or race leader, I will try to explain just my position. I am a nurse, have nursed in most every home in this town for past 9 years, acting at times as assistant to one of the South's best surgeons, Dr. J. Arthur Dosher of this town. I donated to the Red Cross, volunteered during the epidemic of the 1918 flu, and hold a certificate for heroic services rendered over my state. I own property and pay my tax. I'm a Christian. I belong to the Methodist Church. I attend to my own business. I don't interfere with no race of people, and I try to live here as I expect to live when I pass in the great beyond, that is, in peace. I have 7 brothers, law-abiding, supposed to be citizens, denied the same as myself. Hoping and resting assured that you will not use my name in this matter, that I will close. And so Anna heard one more time from the organization. They said, my dear Mrs. Clemens, I have called Ms. Paul's attention to your letter of October 24th describing the registration conditions for colored women in your neighborhood. We have been giving the situation in the South a good deal of thought, but at present we see only one solution to the matter, and that is one which is not available now. we feel that we must press through Congress an enabling act which will place federal authority over the registration and election officials in all of the states, and so make interference with or prevention of the proper execution of the election laws a federal offense. We had hoped to get this enabling act through Congress before its adjournment last spring, but did not get further than the introduction of the measure. We expect to be able to work for the passage of this act at the coming session of Congress. So the women of the National Women's Party were overly optimistic about their ability to get such a federal law passed. It would actually be another 45 years before the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law. Like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton before her, Anna Clemons would not live to have her right to vote. She died in 1956 at the age of 65. Anna meant what she said about keeping her identity private out of fear for repercussions. As far as we know, she took her secret about her letters to her grave. When the Southport Historical Society contacted her relatives still living in Southport, they were not aware of Anna's letters or her courageous efforts to vote. Copies of Anna's letters, written in 1920 from Southport, North Carolina, are on file with the Library of Congress and in the National Archives of the National Women's Party and the NAACP. So, Southport has a right to be proud of all the women in its past who worked for women's rights to vote and who worked to improve the community. We're all better off for the work that they did, and they all deserve to be remembered and honored and celebrated. This is a picture of one such celebration. It's from the 4th of July, 1921. It's taken in front of the Army-Navy Club where they had just finished a pageant. And you can see that there is Uncle Sam and several women draped in stars and stripes. And in the back, there are women wearing sashes that look like they are purple, white, and gold, the colors worn by Alice Paul's suffragists. Now I'll let Carrie Chapman Catt, two-time president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, have the final word. And she said, "Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it." So, the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment was last week, which is why it was in the news. But tomorrow is the date in which it was formally added to the Constitution 100 years ago. It's the 100th anniversary of that. And since 1971, August 26th has been designated Women's Equality Day. So, happy Women's Equality Day. And in closing, I'd like to mention two things. First, please use as an example the women of 1918 who were not derailed by the Spanish flu pandemic. They made plans and then they followed through on those plans. So this year, as we have an election during our own pandemic, please make it a point to plan your vote and then follow through on your plan. And then secondly, I'd like to mention that tomorrow evening there will be an Oak Island Women's Equality Day installation. It's being put on by Carolina Candelaria, and I think she's on the call, and if so, I'm going to let her talk about it, but briefly, it will be outdoors at Middleton Soccer Field from 6 to 7 p.m. Masks are required and social distancing will be observed, but it's an opportunity to dress up as a suffragist or at least wear white and to come out and learn about some of the unsung heroines of the women's movement like Ida Wells and possibly even Anna Clemons. Can you tell about that? Carolee, are you there? Do you want to tell something?
There. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Oh, good. Well, this is something I'm doing myself. And if anyone has their costume, you all know a lot about history, much more than me. And I have had some experience with my research, and I researched a few women. This one, you probably all know her. She's named Sojourner Truth. So I have artists, and I want to invite you, if you make music or art, or you have a woman that you know, like Anna Clemons. Liz told me about her. And if you want to represent in a socially distanced, safe way, you can come tomorrow night to Middleton Park. And I'm going to be there, and we're going to have a giant flag. It's a silent sentinel that I painted. And then we'll have it, other art, if you need it. There'll also be anyone who wants to come. There's an one of the artists that is going to display her works there is Laura McCaddy. And we'll have the installation there, and we're inviting anyone who wants to participate to wear your gloves, wear your mask, and you can come with, you can help carry the flag to put down. You can walk through the exhibit. They're 20 feet apart to just read about these women. There's 12 of them. Some of them are still living. And just walk through or dance through or sing, whatever you want to do. It'll only be there for 2 hours. The exhibit is a walk-through installation, performance art, and you can do whatever you feel you'd like to do to honor them. At the end, we're going to honor them by making our plan, how we're going to vote this year. We're going to offer the League of Women Voters absentee ballots. We're going to offer the 411.org, where you can read about all your candidates. And we'll inspire any young people to come and register others or help elders who may be alone and need someone to sign their ballot. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. It's quite an initiative. Does anybody have any questions about today? Comments? Anything?
I loved it. I learned so much from your presentation. I knew a lot, but I didn't know about Southport, some of the things you said. Thank you.
Okay.
Liz, it's a great presentation, and I can't tell you how many people from the libraries wish you had been our history teacher.
Oh, that's such a nice thing to say.
Thank you again, Liz, for a wonderful program. You always do an outstanding job. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for sitting through it again. I tried to add more things.
Yep, it's always good to have refreshment.
Are your slides available for us to access at other times, Liz?
Yeah, this is being recorded. We'll put it up on the Facebook page. So
if we don't do Facebook, do you have a way to access it? Okay, thank you.
Send it out. Okay, well, this is the last presentation for August. I'll be sending out a list of what we're doing in September coming up. We've got something on the CCC. Scott Lenn is going to be talking about the CCC camp that was in Southport, Camp Sapona. I'm going to be doing something on Dunbar Davis and the Hurricane of 1893. And there's a couple others that are going on. We're going to have the Southport, we're going to have the Historical Society meeting in September. That'll be in the evening, and we're going to be talking about Southport through the eyes of Art Newton. So, and then of course we'll have the Southport storyteller, Mike Royal, on Facebook. So there's a lot coming up in September, and I will send out the information on that. And I hope to see you in some future